Welcome to Slaying the Dragon Part 4. In the previous videos we have seen how white can use the Levenfish attack against the Sicilian Dragon as quite a dangerous weapon. The move f2, f4 sets up a strong threat of e4, e5, chasing away the knight from f6 after white would get a strong initiative. Now we have examined the force of that threat in the introductory lesson in part 1. After that we have looked at the intuitive defense with 6 bishop to g7, like so, in part 2 of the series, and in part 3 we looked at what is considered to be the best defense, 6 knight c6 for black. Okay, in this part we're going to take a look at another plausible 6th move defense for black, which is 6 knight b to d7. Okay. Well, the position in front of you is the position after white's 6th move f2, f4, which threatens the aforementioned e4, e5. So here we go, knight b to d7. Excuse me. Now with this move, black kind of tries to outsmart white. Because maybe you remember from part 3, where black played knight c6, that white was able to exchange this knight, thereby remove the defender from the e5 square and play e4, e5 after all. Okay, now we have seen that in that line, psychologically, black has some kind of a difficult game, because he is kind of forced to rather develop his bishop to e7 instead of to g7, but still, objectively, this is the best defense for him. Now, of course, when black does not play the knight to c6, but to d7 rather, white can no longer exchange the defender from that e5 square, which means that for the moment he has to play a little bit more slow. Okay, and we will see in a second how white can go about that. But first, let's have another look at the position after knight b d7. And I suppose my question for you is, what is the difference between knight b d7 and knight c6? And if knight c6 had the drawback that white could take out the defender on c6 and push e4, e5 anyway, then what would you suppose is the drawback of knight b d7? Okay, so maybe just take a moment, pause the video if you like, and come back after 3 seconds to compare answers. Well, you may have found that the drawback of knight b d7 is quite obvious. It hems in, for instance, the bishop from c8, where in some variations, as we saw in the earlier parts of the video series, the bishop could move to g4, right? Usually developing with some kind of tempo, maybe on the white queen under circumstances. And of course, after knight b d7, that is not the case. That is not possible anymore. A second drawback that I would like to mention here is the drawback that a player normally has when his knights are on the same, what I call, circuit. And I spoke to you about that before in other videos. In this case, both black knights, they are on the same circuit, right? Maybe this black knight would like to go there, but of course it's occupied by the other knight, and vice versa. This knight can never go to d7 because it's occupied by the d7 knight. And normally when knights are stepping on each other's toes, it means they're not really complementing each other. So this also means that there is less activity in the black position in this case. Okay, so that's another theme to always keep in mind. And under such circumstances, of course, the party with both toe-stepping knights would of course like to exchange one of these knights so that they would never ever be able to step on each other's toes anymore. Okay, well, having said that, white does not have the option of playing knight takes c6 and pushing e5. Also, the immediate push e5 is not possible, of course, because black is simply defending the e5 square 2 times. Okay, well, as said, white has to play a little bit slower, and therefore bishop e3 is a good move. I would recommend you play that move after knight bd7. Okay, now this is just a normal developing move, and it also prepares to move the queen from d1 either to, let's say, d2 or maybe to f3, after which white could castle queenside, right, and start a kingside attack, for instance. Okay, now it's black's turn again. What can you do, right? If you move the knight from d7, well then immediately, of course, again the push e4, e5 comes into consideration. So if you put your knight on d7 to defend the e5 square, maybe you should keep it there for the moment at least, right? So what else can we do? The bishop from c8 also can't move. Maybe now it's time to move the bishop from f8 to g7 and castle? Yes, that is possible. But before we look at that, what we could consider the main line, I would like to point out another alternative, because black's queen can also move, right? And it can go to b6, for instance, where it is attacking the b2 pawn, and where it is also pinning the d4 knight, because behind the d4 knight there is an unguarded bishop on e3. Okay, now normally under such circumstances, white may be able to move knight f5, you know, protecting the bishop like so. But in this case, of course, with an unprotected pawn on b2 and also not yet a target on g7, this is, of course, a move that I should not advise you play right now. Okay, so it seems that white should deal with the direct threat here on his b2 pawn. And even though it means that white will not be able to castle queenside, one move that comes into consideration here is rook b1. Now the nice thing of rook b1 is that it very solidly defends the pawn on b2. And after rook b1, it seems that somehow the move queen to b6 didn't really achieve much. And now if white in the subsequent next moves just simply defends his bishop, it will also mean that shortly after, this knight will be able to move, for instance, to f5, right? And I suppose that maybe already white has knight f5 moves. And this means that black's queen on b6 turns out to be not so well placed, and that it has to leave her stance, meaning that white has one extra tempi for his development, and that he will emerge with a better position from the opening. Now, of course, after queen b6, you can also look at the poisoned pawn-like variations with, let's say, queen d2 here, that also look very interesting. Now, of course, black can consider to take this pawn, but he should really be careful, because in these positions, for instance, rook b1, when queen a3 is the only move, he could run into quite a fierce initiative. White always has such moves as rook b3 or maybe e5 in this case. Let's just have a look at e5 in this case. That looks interesting, because we said that e5 is well defended, right? But I suppose that if you play e5 in this moment and you try now to take this pawn, it turns out that this pawn was also quite poisonous, because now knight c to b5 has very serious threats to both the queen on a3 and also the square here on c7. Now, maybe you can just try to somehow defend both problems with such a move as queen c5, safeguarding the queen, simultaneously protecting also the square on c7. But in that case, white really has a very crushing move. And well, let's just pause the video, take a look, and come back after 3 seconds to compare answers. What would you play here with white? Well, white has developed so many pieces, and black has lost so many times snatching these two pawns, that it somehow doesn't really surprise us anymore that a move like knight e6 is just simply winning. There are too many threats here against excuse me, against the queen now, like so, and also there are threats against this c7 square, and this knight is loose, and maybe under some circumstances, if this knight moves to c7, the bishop could come out to b5, either with a check or maybe pinning the queen once the queen has gone to c6, for instance. So this is a winning position for white. Okay, so let's end the discussion there of queen b6 when I recommend a queen, excuse me, rook b1, and so on. And I suppose that you will emerge with an opening plus there for white. Okay, let's return to the main line then after bishop e3, where of course, yeah, the most natural move is just to follow up with bishop g7, right? But bishop g7 now gives white the opportunity to execute his plan of queenside castling. For instance, queen f3 looks like a very nice move here. And if black now castles, then white will castle queenside. Now I suppose, again, we can take a look at the position and ask ourselves, what can black do here? Maybe he still has to be on the lookout for e4, e5, and maybe he could also try to make use of the position that the queen and the rook are sitting on the same diagonal here, right? What about the move knight c5, which threatens bishop g4, which would mean that white, for the moment, does not have any time to play e4, e5. Well, I suppose you would play the simple h2, h3 and threaten e4, e5 again. You've taken away the g4 square for these black pieces. You're threatening e4, e5. Maybe it also helps you to push these kingside pawns. And I suppose you have a very nice advantage here to go. So maybe knight c5 doesn't really do the trick, right? But if we can't move the knight, then what to do? How to develop our queenside, for instance? Well, you can play the Najdorf idea here with a6, right? Maybe preparing b7, b5, like so, and bringing the bishop out on the long diagonal. That's a nice idea. And sometimes they refer to this pawn structure as the Dragon-Dorf, you know, where black plays with a dragon setup, but subsequently also with a Najdorf setup. Okay, and this move is maybe a tricky waiting move also, because white can go wrong here. Now, in the beginning we said, of course, that the knight on b7, on d7 blocks the bishop on c8. But if that knight from d7 could move away with tempo, then all of a sudden the bishop would also become active along that c8, h3 diagonal, and may even jump into g4. So white could go wrong here, for instance, with bishop g4, after which knight b6 all of a sudden attacks this loose bishop and also opens up the diagonal of the bishop to go to g4. And now, of course, if white would keep the bishop on that diagonal where he just placed it, then bishop g4 would, of course, lead to some advantage for black. He will win the exchange, maybe white will have some compensation for it, but of course this is not the way you want to go. And therefore it is always important not to play too mechanically, because bishop c4 looks like a very natural move, but of course black will be able just to attack the bishop with tempo and open up the diagonal for his bishop. So if this is a vulnerable square, maybe white could consider either playing h3 or continue and finish his development with another very plausible move, bishop e2. I recommend you play bishop e2 here, because then there are no discovered attacks, and maybe black should just think of something for himself here. Now, let's see what would happen after b5. Would you think that b5 is a good move? Just pause the video here and come back after 3 seconds. Okay, well, maybe now you've seen one of the purposes of the queen on b3. Of course, b7, b5 is a very bad move because it immediately loses to the thematical e4, e5, right? The Levenfish push. And not only do we attack the knight on f6, also do we attack the rook on a8. So white is going to win material and in the progress the game. Now normally these pushes with b7, b5 are possible if black's queen were on c7. Because in that case the thrust of e4, e5 could be answered with the very nasty counter attack of bishop b7, right? Which in turn attacks the white queen on f3. So white would have no time to take the knight on f6, right? So in that case, black would be fine. But of course, in this case, there is no such thing as a queen on c7. Okay. Right, so b7 is not a very good idea here, so black has to resort to other countermeasures, and if he thinks long enough, maybe he can come up with rook e8, for instance, which tries to hold white's expansion in a whole other way. And we see this also from other Najdorf positions where black plays without, of course, the fianchetto on g7, but with the knight from b8 to d7. There, normally the e7, e5 thrust is a very normal move to try and stop white somehow in the center, or maybe even to win the e5 square for his e5 knight. Okay, well, let's just go on a few moves, and then you will have some study material for you to build on. I suppose that g4 here is a very nice move, trying to play against the f6 knight. If it's not possible with e4, e5, then why not play against that knight with g4, g5, right? Okay, now e5 maybe is possible, and of course we don't really want to take, right? Because then we would invite that somewhat clumsy knight into the beautiful e5 square, and all of a sudden this knight is radiating great tactical power, right? It's brutal, and simultaneously attacking here the queen on f3 and the pawn on g4, and also releasing the power from the bishop, and in combination with the power of the other knight, well, maybe all of a sudden black has a great initiative, because he's going to win the g4 pawn at least. So you have to be very careful, because, well, that's one of the points, of course, of black's play. So in this case you'd have to be prudent and just retreat your knight to b3, right? And now, if black takes himself on f4 to create a square on e5 for his knight, then of course you will recapture with the queen, so that the queen will no longer be attacked by the knight once it emerges here on e5, and I want to do that with red. Okay, thank you very much. And also a subsequent advantage, of course, is that now white all of a sudden has very serious counter pressure on the d6 pawn. So it would seem that really the only move to stop that counter pressure is the blocking knight e5, when maybe black can say to himself, whew, finally I somehow freed my position, you know, and now my bishop on c8 is free. I've got a great square on e5 for my knight, and also my knight on f6 is active, and I've blocked the pressure against the pawn on d6, but unfortunately for him it is white to move, and here comes the g-pawn. Okay, now the g-pawn is threatened, but it is a big boy, it can save itself. It plays g4, g5, and now where does that knight go? Of course, if the knight goes here, that's really quite horrible, because then white will play rook d6, you know, and this is just terrible. He'll probably bring the other rook round to the d file also. He's immediately crushing through into black's position. By the way, if that's not enough, these knights are again stepping on each other's toes here, so that's also not very nice. So really, after g5, even though you don't like to play the move, I think the best one is knight h5, just containing the damage for as much as possible. But of course, this allows for the wrecking bishop takes h5. And after g takes h5, e5, it turns out that black's king position is seriously compromised here. He has a horrible pawn structure, and also this move chased away the knight, which was in turn a very important defender of this beautiful central outpost on d5. And now white can also jump in with a very strong knight here. Okay, of course, by means of compensation, black does have the bishop pair, but it seems only of academic value, because the quality of white's pieces and his position, and probably most notably his king position and pawn structure, is much higher than that of the whole of black's army, and in this position he has a very nice advantage. Not winning yet, I would say, but you know, there are so many weaknesses. He can just pile up on the f6 square. Maybe he can just somehow reroute his queen and just try to take this guy, or put pressure on the f file like so. Maybe bring his bishop around, maybe just take out the knight so he could crush through on the f7 square. Maybe he can reroute this knight again to f5. It's really horrible. It's horrible. Maybe in higher sense this position is already lost for black. So you can see the consequences of such a move of knight b d7, right? And well, as it turns out, indeed black has to play very, very carefully already from the 6th move on, and that is because white's idea is so concrete. The threat of e4, e5 is so direct, and the initiative that it would hand white is so strong that you really have to know what you're doing here with black, because otherwise, as we've just seen in some lines, you'll just simply be on the receiving end very, very quickly. Okay, well, I hope that this part 4 of the video series, How to Slay the Dragon, has again contributed to your enthusiasm on studying this line, and maybe see if you can beat the dragon with this. As we mentioned before, it's a very common weapon on the club and international tournament level, and my experience is that most black players are really not so familiar with this f2, f4, right? Because everybody plays the bishop c1, e3 line, and then theory goes on and on and on and on. But the theory of the Levenfish attack is less expanded, you could say, and there's a lot of room for your own investigation and creativity, I suppose. And even if a black player knows that knight c6 is the best move, you know, because they all have these books, what to play after this 6 white move, what to play after this 6 move, what to play after this 6 white move, and then they just see f2, f4, you play knight c6, and there's one main line, and they go, okay, sure, I'll just play whenever that's knight c6 when it comes on the board. But then, you know, you just play like I explained to you in part 3 with knight takes c6, b takes c6, e5, etc. And then just have him figure out what to do, you know, because he'll just have problems with his knight now on f6. He'll have problems choosing the right development square for his bishop on f8. He will have problems with his weakness on d6. And even though there is an objective way through this, you know, it's a very edgy way along a high cliff canyon. So, okay, enough said, I suppose, for this video explication. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you in part 5, because this is not where it ends.